All right, everyone get ready because today we are going deep into India's economic reforms and liberalization.
Oh, yeah.
It all starts in 1991, and we're going to go all the way to the present. So,
Wow.
yeah, buckle up. We have got some really interesting sources to look at today.
Cool.
Yeah, we've got economic analyses, and we've got details about those liberalization policies,
Uh-huh.
and even a look at how technology played a role in all of this.
That's going to be interesting.
Yeah, it really is. So India basically went through a huge transformation during this time.
Yeah.
It opened up its economy and kind of stepped on the global stage in this whole new way.
It really did. Yeah.
Yeah, so as always on the show, we're not just looking at like what happened,
Yeah.
but we're also looking at like why did it happen? And so what?
Yeah.
What were the impacts of all these changes, on society,
Mm-hmm.
on India's global integration? Did everyone benefit equally? Yeah, so there are some really interesting pieces to this story, like the whole Green Revolution and its uneven effects, the rise of coalition politics, even the role of political dynasties during all of this.
I mean, yeah, it really is a very complex story and it's still unfolding today. But to really get how big of a shift happened in the 1990s, we have to rewind a bit and look at the economic climate before all that.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. So paint a picture for us. What was the situation like back then?
All right, so before 1991, India had a mostly closed economy with the government in control of a lot of things.
Yeah.
It was all about self-reliance and trying to replace imports with stuff made in India itself.
Right.
But even further back, the picture gets really interesting.
Okay.
For example, back in the 1920s, India saw high prices, even though the government was really trying to bring them down.
Now that's interesting. Why wouldn't the government's efforts work?
Well, it's because India wasn't totally isolated from what was happening in the global economy even back then.
No.
World market prices were high, and that had a spillover effect.
Oh, okay.
What's really cool is that if you look at price trends even closer, you see this tight connection between prices in areas like non-agriculture and import prices.
Okay.
And that was in those pre-war years, but then that connection changed as we moved into the 1930s and beyond.
So even before the whole liberalization era, external factors were already kind of like messing things up,
Yeah,
almost like foreshadowing.
exactly. It's like a little sneak peek into what was coming later.
Wow.
And understanding all that context before 1991 makes the 1991 reforms even more dramatic. It was like a huge turning point.
All right, so let's dig into those reforms then. What were the big changes that really marked this, transition toward a market economy?
So it was this whole package of policies meant to dismantle what was called the license Raj.
The license rush. Okay.
Yeah, it was basically a system of permits and regulations that a lot of people said was holding back growth and new ideas. These reforms, they wanted to open up the Indian economy.
Gotcha. And what were the main ideas driving these reforms? What were they trying to achieve?
It was all about liberalization, deregulation, privatization, taking down barriers to trade. The goal was to get foreign investment, encourage competition, and basically boost economic growth.
And it's interesting, this move toward liberalization seemed to happen at the same time as big changes in India's political scene, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, and then that whole period of grief and leadership change. It makes you wonder how these events might have, indirectly influenced this push for a new economic direction.
It's a good point. While it's tough to draw a straight line, I think it's clear that the political situation always influences economic decisions, so it definitely adds another layer to the story.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got these 1991 reforms trying to reshape the economy, but we've also got the Green Revolution happening around the same time. Can you break that down for us?
For sure. Starting in the late 1960s, the Green Revolution led to this massive increase in how much food was being produced, especially in 67 and 68. Think new high-yielding types of crops, more irrigation, modern farming techniques, all of it leading to a huge jump in grain output.
Sounds like a total win. But I remember reading about how not everyone actually benefited equally from all of this.
You're right, that's one of the important things to remember here. For example, wheat production saw a way bigger increase than rice, which led to differences between regions. Places like Punjab and Haryana, they became big wheat producers and benefited much more than places like Bengal.
So it's a success story,
Yeah.
but definitely with some twists and turns and unintended consequences.
Totally.
It really shows how even seemingly good changes often have layers to them.
Exactly. Progress is rarely a straight line, and understanding those nuances is super important for getting the full picture of what really happened.
Right.
And this idea of uneven impact is something we see a lot during this whole economic reform period.
So speaking of all the different things happening at once, alongside the Green Revolution and these 1991 reforms, We also have all this new technology and infrastructure being developed.
Hmm.
How did that play a role in India's transformation?
Technology was a game changer, you know?
Yeah.
Investments in things like telecommunications and IT led to this boom in the IT sector. And infrastructure projects like expanding transportation networks and power generation, those were crucial for economic growth and connecting different parts of the country and making things more efficient.
It almost feels like a paradox, though, right?
Uh-huh.
We're seeing all this progress with technology, but then you've still got these big challenges like poverty and inequality. It's almost like there are two Indias existing side by side.
That is such a sharp observation, and it's a really important theme during this time period. It really shows that complicated connection between economic growth, advances in technology, and what's actually happening in society.
Yeah, and it makes you think about the people in all of this,
Absolutely.
how their lives were changed and the social impact of these big reforms.
Yeah, the social impact is a huge part of this story. We saw changes in jobs with more focus on service industries and income distribution was affected, and there were definitely impacts on people's ability to move up in society. Economic transformation doesn't happen in a bubble. It has real consequences for real people.
And didn't this time period also see some major political and social unrest? I remember reading about the Mandel Commission and quotas for certain castes.
Yes, the Mandel Commission made its recommendations in the late 1980s. They wanted to fix historical inequalities by reserving spots for lower castes in education and government jobs.
Right.
But it caused a lot of social and political unrest.
Wow.
There's intense debate and even violence.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is in India. The political stuff, the social stuff, and the economic stuff. Events in one area have this ripple effect on everything else.
100%. You have to understand all of these pieces together to really grasp how complicated India's journey was during this time.
So while India was dealing with all these internal changes and struggles, it was also becoming more connected to the global economy. What were the good and bad things about this globalization?
Globalization gave India a chance to enter new markets and get foreign investment, which helped its economic growth a lot. But it also created new challenges, things like increased competition and having to adjust to those ups and downs of the global economy.
Sounds like a real balancing act, trying to take advantage of globalization without getting hurt by it.
Exactly. And during this period, India had specific things it had to deal with on top of all that. For example, there was a drought in 1987, and even though agriculture was growing overall, it had a huge effect on inflation. It's interesting to look back and see how these events played out alongside the global economic changes that were happening and how India navigated all of that.
It's fascinating how all these things, the economic reforms, the Green Revolution, technology, social change, and globalization, are all woven together in India's story from 1991 on. It's clearly a very complicated, fascinating, and significant period.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And getting this period is key for anyone who wants to understand where India stands in the world today and where it might go in the years to come.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's so much more to explore and discuss about this era of economic reform in India, and we're going to continue this deep dive in our next part.
Oh, can't wait.
Yeah, me too. We'll be back after a quick break.
Sounds good.
It's wild how all those factors, the economics, the social stuff, technology, and the global scene are all connected. It makes you realize that to understand history, you can't just focus on dates and events.
Oh, for sure.
You have to get these complicated relationships.
Absolutely. And as we dig deeper into these economic reforms, we see how these connected forces shaped not just the economy, but India's politics and even its social fabric.
Okay, so let's get into the politics. How did this whole liberalization era change the political landscape?
One of the biggest impacts was the rise of coalition politics. The decades after the 1991 reforms saw the Congress Party losing its grip on power, which led to all these multi-party coalitions at the national level.
So from one party basically running the show to a much more divided and diverse political scene, that's a big shift.
Oh, yeah, it definitely was. And it brought its own set of challenges.
Yeah.
Making stable governments became a lot harder, like we saw with the Janata Party's short time in power in the late 70s and then Indira Gandhi coming back.
Right.
The 1990s saw a bunch of coalition governments, each with its own unique problems.
I bet that was a time of some serious political maneuvering and backroom deals.
Oh, absolutely. It was. And it's fascinating to think about how those political shifts were tied to the social and economic changes from the reforms.
Yeah.
For example, when regional parties gained power, it often reflected what certain communities wanted and were worried about, communities that were directly affected by all these economic changes.
It's like different groups were all trying to get their piece of the pie as the economy opened up and new opportunities popped up.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this fight for resources and political power also made social tensions worse and led to more identity politics, which made everything even more complex.
And this brings us back to that modernization paradox we were talking about.
Right.
We see economic growth and all these advances in technology and globalization, but the divisions in society and inequalities are still there.
Exactly. The economic reforms didn't just magically fix India's deep-rooted social problems. In fact, in some cases, these problems got even worse as the gap between the rich and poor grew wider.
It's like this back and forth between progress and the weight of history, you know?
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And this tension is something we see over and over again in India's story after liberalization.
So amidst all this change and uncertainty, did new leaders step up? I'm thinking about figures like Rajiv Gandhi. He seemed to represent a break from the old way of doing things.
Yeah, Rajiv Gandhi, who took over after his mother Indira Gandhi was assassinated in 1984, was definitely seen as part of a new generation of leaders. He was young and charismatic, and a lot of people saw him as a symbol of modernization. He really embraced technology and pushed for those economic reforms, trying to bring India into a new era.
He seemed like someone who understood how the world was changing and wanted India to be a part of it.
Right. But even with this new leadership, the path to progress was bumpy.
Yeah.
Rajiv Gandhi faced a lot of challenges like political opposition, social unrest, and economic limitations.
And tragically, his life was cut short by another assassination, which really highlights how unstable things were back then.
It definitely does. His assassination in 91, just as India was starting down this road of economic liberalization, was a huge setback for the country. It was a harsh reminder of how fragile progress can be and the constant threat to stability.
So as India was going through all these internal changes, where did it stand on the world stage? How did these transformations affect its role globally?
It's interesting because India's economic liberalization happened at the same time as the end of the Cold War and the rise of a new world order.
Yeah.
As the global economy became more interconnected, India saw a chance to become a major player.
It's almost like a coming-of-age story. You know, India stepping onto the world stage with this new confidence and ambition.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
India started to get more involved in international trade, looked for foreign investment, and joined global organizations. Its economic growth and tech advances were getting attention, and people started seeing it as a rising power.
But I imagine being more involved globally also brought its own set of problems. How do you balance what's good for your country with the demands of globalization?
That's the key question that India, like a lot of developing nations, had to deal with. It had to navigate complicated relationships with other countries, compete in a global market, and address concerns about its internal issues, all while trying to secure its place in the world. It wasn't easy.
Sounds like trying to juggle a bunch of things at once. Each one's super important.
Exactly. And this balancing act continues to shape how India approaches the world, even today.
So we've covered the economic reforms, the political shifts, the social changes, and India's move into the global system. That's a lot.
It is, but by understanding how all these things connect, we start to see just how complex India's journey has been from 1991 onward.
And it's a journey that's still going on. The 1991 reforms were a huge turning point, but they're just one part of a much bigger story.
Definitely, and understanding this part is crucial for making sense of where India is now and where it's headed.
You know, as we've been talking about all of this, I keep thinking about something you said earlier, that progress is rarely straightforward.
Yeah.
It feels like India's story is a perfect example of that.
It really is. It's a story of progress, setbacks, triumphs, and challenges, all woven together in a very human way.
And as India continues on this path, what are some of the big questions we should be asking? What should our listeners be thinking about as they follow India's story?
Well, I think one of the most important questions is about who's actually benefiting from this economic growth. We've seen how these reforms have helped lift millions of people out of poverty, but we've also seen how inequality has stuck around and sometimes even gotten worse. So how can India make sure that everyone benefits from its economic progress, not just a select few?
That's a crucial question. And as India becomes a bigger player on the world stage, what role will it play? Will it be a force for good in the world, promoting peace and cooperation and sustainable development? How will it handle its relationships with other powerful countries, especially in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable?
Those are all really important questions, and I think the answers depend on a lot of things, like what's happening politically in India, its economic priorities, and of course the global situation.
And we can't forget about the challenges that India still faces internally. Things like poverty inequality, social tensions, and environmental issues. Those could really hold India back if they're not addressed.
You're absolutely right, and I think it's important to remember that success for India isn't just about economic numbers. It's about the well-being of its people, the strength of its democracy, and its ability to create a more fair and sustainable society.
So it's a story of progress,
Ah,
but also a story of things that still need to be done, a story that's still being written.
exactly, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
As we've been talking about India's journey, it's got me thinking about how much history shapes the present.
Yeah,
It's like those echoes we were discussing before, how events from like decades ago or even centuries ago still have an impact today.
it's true, and sometimes those echoes are more like a shout than a whisper.
Totally. And it made me think about the East India Company, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
It's incredible how this trading company, driven by profit, ended up ruling a whole nation as huge and complicated as India for almost a century.
Yeah, the East India Company's story really shows you how economic ambition and political power can get all tangled up, and how that can have consequences you never intended, consequences that last a really long time. It also highlights the lasting effects of colonialism, something that is still relevant in India today.
It really makes you realize how much the choices made in the past, by governments, companies, or even individuals, can have a lasting impact.
They really do, and we need to be aware of those shadows as we look ahead to the future.
Okay, so let's bring it back to those 1991 reforms. We've looked at how they affected India's economy, its politics, and its society. But what about the long-term implications for India's future? You mentioned that it's a story that's still being written, so what chapters do you think we might see next?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The 1991 reforms definitely set India on a path of economic growth and globalization. But like we've talked about, there are still debates about who's benefiting from all of that and whether it's actually addressed those deep-rooted challenges that India faces.
We've talked about that whole rising tide lifts all boats idea and how in reality some boats are just better prepared to handle rough waters. India's job is to make sure all those boats rise up, so to speak. How do you think that can happen?
Well, first things first, tackling inequality has to be a major focus.
Yeah.
That means things like education, healthcare, and social safety nets, making sure that the benefits of growth reach everybody, not just a select few.
It's about creating opportunities for everyone, not just the privileged few.
Exactly. And as India becomes a more powerful player on the global stage, which it definitely is, how will it use that power? Will it be a force for good in the world, promoting peace and cooperation and sustainable development?
It's like India's at a crossroads, having to decide what kind of global leader it wants to be.
That's a great way to put it. And the choices it makes will have a big impact, not just for India, but for the whole world.
So what do you see as some of the biggest challenges and opportunities ahead?
One big challenge will be navigating this increasingly complicated global landscape as India's economy and military grow stronger. It'll need to figure out its role in the world order, balance its relationships with different countries, and deal with security concerns, especially in a region that's often unstable.
It's like stepping onto this massive global chessboard where every move you make could start a chain reaction.
That's a perfect analogy. And internally, those ongoing problems we've discussed, poverty, inequality, social tensions, and environmental sustainability, those are all things that could hold India back if they aren't handled effectively.
It's like building a house, like you said before. You
Right.
need a solid foundation to support everything else. If you ignore the foundation, even the most impressive structure is at risk.
Exactly. But let's not forget about the opportunities India has so much going for it. A young and energetic population, a booming tech sector, and an entrepreneurial spirit that's truly amazing.
It's like having all the ingredients for success. Now it's just about finding the right recipe, combining those ingredients in a way that creates something truly remarkable.
Well said. And in the end, India's success will come down to its ability to use its strengths, address its weaknesses, and make smart choices as it navigates this complex and ever-changing world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into India's economic journey, what's the one key takeaway you want to leave with our listeners?
I'd say India's story is a testament to human resilience, to the power of transformation, and to the enduring human spirit. It's a story that's still unfolding, full of possibilities and potential, and ultimately, the future of India is something that each and every Indian citizen has a role in shaping.
What a powerful message. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning about India's journey, its history, its present, and the possibilities that lie ahead. It's a journey full of insights, challenges, and ultimately hope.
It's been great diving into this with you.
Likewise, and to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into India's economic transformation. If you're as fascinated by this story as we are, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your questions, your own insights. We'd love to connect with you. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. This has been The Deep Dive.